Custom power steering hoses for a 1980 Camaro LS swap. We knew that we needed to make some custom hoses to go from our new power steering pump to our stock 1980 Camaro power steering gearbox, but we didn't know much more than that. So the approach we took was to buy both of the stock hoses. This is more of a hose barb than a hose, and use that at least to get the information on what type of fitting would go on the end of each of our new custom hoses. Now this short guy is for the low pressure hose that connects right here on the reservoir of the Holley power steering pump. And here is a stock high pressure hose for a 1980 Camaro. From the very beginning, our plan was to return these two hoses as soon as our two custom hoses were made. Next, we needed to figure out, are the two fittings the same or are they different? And if they're different, which one of our hoses goes in which one of these holes? We determined that the low pressure hose barb goes in the hole that is further away from the camera here, and the high pressure hose goes in the hole that is closer to the camera. As you can plainly see, the new hose would need to be very different from the old one. Coming up with our final hose barb design was an iterative process. Dylan drew something up in CAD, and then we'd print it out, go stick it in the power steering gearbox, and see if we liked the angle that it was coming off at, and then we'd tweak it and try again. This is the actual final drawing that I took to my local tube making shop and had them make into the tube that you see sitting here on top of that piece of paper. As you can see, the real thing is somewhat different from the drawing, but the differences hardly matter. Here's the high pressure hose design that we came up with. Dylan drew this up in Fusion 360, which is a CAD program that you can download and use for free. The female 6AN fitting is what attaches to the power steering pump. Then there's a 100-degree bend to compensate for the power steering pump's slightly downward angle. You will see what I mean in just a minute. We included a 10-inch section of flexible hose to give the hose enough room to do about a 180-degree bend and circle back to the power steering gearbox. We took the drawing to our local tube and hose shop, and this is what they made. It turned out almost exactly like what we were picturing in our heads. Before we could install our new low-pressure hose barb, we had to put a little black power steering O-ring onto the threaded end of this fitting. With that done, Dylan was able to go ahead and start it and angle it just behind the power steering pump as we had intended. Then it was time to install the high pressure power steering hose. As you can see, there's an O-ring on this end as well. Installing this fitting and getting it to start threading actually proved to be a little bit tricky, but just staying with it and trying slightly different angles is what worked. Then Dylan was able to bend the hose around and go ahead and attach the 6AN female fitting to the 6AN male fitting of the power steering pump. The next thing we needed to do was go ahead and start tightening the fittings, starting with the fitting of the high pressure hose into the power steering gearbox. Next, it was time to tighten the low pressure hose barb. There's not a lot of room there, so it pays to be patient as you're tightening up this tube nut. Of the three fittings, the attachment of the high pressure hose to the power steering pump is probably the most tricky one to tighten because you need three hands. You need one to keep that hose from spinning around while you tighten. You need a hand to hold a wrench to keep the fitting of the power steering pump from spinning. And you need one to spin the actual female 6AN fitting onto the power steering pump. So here's some 3/8 power steering hose sold by the foot at our local O'Reilly. The main thing that I noticed is just how bumpy the surface is. I don't know if that's just to make it look different than fuel line or vacuum line, but it's pretty cool looking. Now Dylan's working that low pressure power steering hose onto the plastic hose barb that's attached to the reservoir. Notice how he is supporting that barb just to make sure that even though he's pressing hard, the barb does not get broken off. Now Dylan is securing the hose to the barb using a good old-fashioned and cheap worm gear hose clamp. The last thing left for us to do was to figure out how long we wanted the low pressure hose to be and where to route it. Now, because it's going down, it's especially important to make sure that it doesn't interfere with anything, even when things move. So I don't care if the suspension is getting compressed. I don't care if you're turning hard right, hard left. You got to make sure that that hose stays out of the way of everything. With the hose chopped to length, Dylan is wrapping it around and he's going to start working it onto that hose barb. But before he started working it on, he had to make sure that he had a hose clamp on the hose, or else he'd be putting it on twice. So here comes that clamp. He's just going to tighten it up with a flat-bladed screwdriver, and then he'll be done. The routing of the two hoses seemed a little bit weird to me at first, but I quickly got used to it, and now I actually like it. It saved us from having to have a remote reservoir, and I'm very happy with how this project turned out. I hope you found that useful, and as always, thank you for watching. Now for the rest of the story. After 1 year, the fittings going into the gearbox look good. The metal portion of our high-pressure hose definitely does not look good. I wish we had painted it in the first place. We'll paint it anyway, but it will be a lot more trouble.